All right, let's return now and think about the literary structure of Isaiah. And you'll see in the notes that I have listed for you the usages of Assyria and Babylon. It is significant that all of the usages except one for Assyria occur in the first 39 chapters of the book. Now, Babylon is introduced to us early in the book, chapter 13, that we'll see next week, and vitally in chapter 39, a reflection of what is in 2 Kings chapter 20, that Isaiah gives to Hezekiah the prophecy that the nation that is going to come and take and destroy the palace and the temple and take the vessels of the temple back to their home country will be Babylon. And then looks forward and speaks, as we will see, to those who are going to experience that. And yet even for him, the last mention of Babylon is going to be chapter 48. But this helps us to appreciate the fact that at least historically, that the oracles we read in the book, and here's the basic chart as far as I would see the structure, that certainly 1:1, the reigns of Uzziah through Hezekiah, these kings of Judah who were reigning during Isaiah's ministry, during Isaiah's life, were against the backdrop of the Assyrian Empire, when Assyria had the domination. Remember that Assyria begins to attack toward the west in 745 BC and continues to control the west until 605 BC and the Battle of Carchemish. So from 745 to 605 BC, Assyria was the dominant power within the ancient Near East. And of course that power rose from the period from 745 to, right around 700 BC. And then slowly but surely there was a decline that rapidly increased from 636 to 605 BC, and then Babylon takes over. So this is where Isaiah lived. This is his historical context. And even though very rarely does he speak about the exact year or the exact circumstances that led to the messages that are brought together in the first 35 chapters, it seems as though this is the background. This is the historical background that led to these messages, and that these messages were first proclaimed publicly, and then later Isaiah crafted them together in the book as we have it now. Then in chapters 36 to 39, we have this historical section, which is very much like what is in 2 Kings chapters 18 through 20, that begin with the 601 invasion by the Assyrians, with the resulting siege of Jerusalem, and the faith of Hezekiah, and God's great deliverance that he brings. And so even within Isaiah's own day, he prophesies and experiences Yahweh's deliverance. He sees that those who trust Yahweh are delivered. And so did Hezekiah. So did the men and women, children of Jerusalem of 701 BC. Assyria is defeated. And significantly, this is the apex of Assyria's power in the Levant, in the western area of from Mesopotamia, the bridge between Mesopotamia and Egypt, the Levant, the eastern coast, the western area from Mesopotamia, the eastern coastland of the Mediterranean. And Assyria is never a major military, political player to the extent it had been through 701 BC again. It will be ultimately replaced, as we said, by Babylon. They will become the next invaders and the next major players in that area. And before that, we have the folly of Hezekiah. Now, he did die, as we believe, in 686 BC, and God granted him an additional 15 years of life, as was prophesied in chapter 38 of Isaiah. It would seem as though this took place somewhere around 702, 701 BC, and how this all played in with the siege. It seems as though this might be historically displaced. That actually the sickness and the physical deliverance of Hezekiah from death took place before the events of 701 BC. But they're placed in this way historically, and the author of Kings was probably written after the book of Isaiah, followed that same order that is in Isaiah of putting Babylon at the climax, because in Isaiah, that prepares the way for what is in the last 27 chapters of the book. So you can see that the Assyrian background comes to an end at the end of chapter 37. All right, the first two chapters of the history, the historical connection, bring the historical background. The Assyrians didn't think of themselves so hysterical. The Assyrian background, and then with the prophecy concerning Babylon, introduces, as it were, historically what we read in the last 27 chapters of Isaiah. Now, a great movement, as we take a look at how chapter 1 begins after the introduction, after the title in 1:1. And this is a title for the complete book of Isaiah, the vision of Isaiah, the vision singular of Isaiah he saw during the reigns of Uzziah through Hezekiah. And so this is a title for the totality of the book. All the visions come during this historical time period. All that is recounted is given to Isaiah during his lifetime. There is not a later second Isaiah or third Isaiah writing in the name of Isaiah whose writings become added to this book. The title is for the book as a whole. Now, certainly, predominantly in the first 35 chapters, even beginning with the first message in chapter 1, that even though ultimately Isaiah will speak of restoration, salvation, certainly his message begins on a note of judgment. So to use what's in cracking Old Testament code, certainly in Isaiah, oracles of judgment precede oracles of salvation. And oracles of judgment begin with a spelling out of the people's sin and what God is going to do if there is no repentance. Chapter 1 begins in that way, though by the end of chapter 1, Isaiah is already speaking, as we've looked at, of how God is going to, in a military operation, is going to deal with his enemies and establish Jerusalem as he had determined from the very beginning. But because basically what we have in these 35 chapters are speeches, are messages, are oracles, and because they begin with judgment, the title that is usually used for the first 35 chapters is condemnation. Now be careful, because there is salvation in the first 35 chapters, and there will be confrontation of Israel's sin, the people's sin, in chapters 40 to 66. We're talking about the major tenet, the major thrust. The major thrust of the first 35 chapters is condemnation. There's more sin and judgment than there is salvation. Now, chapter 40 is going to begin with comfort, with consolation. Now God is going to call Isaiah to bring comfort to Jerusalem. Comfort, comfort my people, says your God. Jerusalem, my people, your God, has commanded me, says the prophet, to bring comfort, to speak kindly, to speak to the heart of Jerusalem. Call out to her that her warfare has ended. Her iniquity has been removed. She has received from the Lord's hand double for all her sins. All right, that sin is now in the past. And so God's plan for the future will come to fruition. And then basically the next 27 chapters are how God deals with the sin so that his promises for his people can come to fruition. And now he is speaking, and of course that comfort has to come to those in the future. It's not comfort for the present day. And we see him, as it were, in Jerusalem now, speaking to those who are in Babylon, and speaking and how God is going to use their time in Babylon as a prelude to what he has ultimately to purify his people and ultimately establish Jerusalem again as a city for rejoicing and a city that will glorify the Lord in the future. Now, one of the things that shows that Isaiah is a book and is a unified whole, and so much so that there is a movement, depending upon what sources there might be, and multiple sources, but even a movement among more liberal commentators today to emphasize the unity of the book as we have it now, rather than its disunity. Because notice how Isaiah 1:2 begins. Listen, O heavens, and hear, O earth. The call to the heavens and the earth. Then you go over to Isaiah chapter 65, verse 17. For behold, I create new heavens and a new earth. So the heavens and the earth that are spoken of at the very beginning of Isaiah return at the very end of Isaiah, heavens and earth. And then take a look at how Isaiah chapter 1 ends. In verse 31. Isaiah 1:31, and the strong man will become tender. his work also a spark. Thus they shall both burn together, the man and his work, and there will be none to quench. Take a look at how chapter 66, verse 24 ends. Then they will go forth and look on the corpses of the men who've transgressed against me. By the way, rebelled against me. For their worm shall not die, and their fire shall not be quenched. Those who have rebelled, their worm shall not die, their fire shall not be quenched. They shall be an abhorrence to all flesh, to all mankind. So Isaiah 1 ends on none to quench. In Isaiah 66:24, the fire shall not be quenched.
Sorry for interrupting. I just had a question. How would the Israelites, how did they get to the point where by the time Paul was writing Romans, they were so convinced that just because they were the children of Abraham that they would not suffer punishment, when there's clear verses like this that if you are a transgressor, you will suffer punishment? What covenantally, or what would they point to say, well, we're okay, we got a free?
Yeah, well, the question is, what changed Israel's thoughts? What changed Israel's thoughts basically was Pharisaism. That they learned their lesson coming out of the exile. That they recognized that the desolation of Jerusalem and their time in exile was a result of their sin. There was, I think, an Israelite either or. Even or, that wasn't the one. Now, not yet. That they were already reaping, at least being back in the land, some of the promises, with more still to come. And that they viewed themselves as sinners, but not lawbreakers. I think a great illustration of that is, Paul in Philippians 3, where he speaks in his, as to his religious heritage, a Pharisee, and as to the law, blameless. Now, he didn't mean by that he was sinless, but there was not this rampant disobedience to the law anymore that they had determined what the law required, and they lived up to that, or they brought the prerequisite on the basis of repentance. They brought the prerequisite sacrifice, to deal with it under the law. So they viewed themselves as okay. They viewed themselves as basically law keepers. So, and that was, I think, the resulting, you got to realize, the major influence upon the people of Israel, the Amorites, the people of the land, even though the Pharisees, just castigated them because of their spiritual stupidity. Nevertheless, the Pharisees were their teachers and gave off an air of, we are righteous, and if you follow our teaching, if you follow our ways, you'll be righteous too. Yeah, so that, and that gets in, James, that's more of a New Testament issue on, Israel, Judaism during, the Second Temple, which is a highly debated, topic today on exactly what was the spiritual status, what was the spiritual viewpoint of the different parties of Judaism at the time of the New Testament. Because we do have certain scholars who say, well, the New Testament is wrong in portraying Israel this way. And I don't think Paul was wrong at all. I mean, but I think there was a pride. It was like we've learned our lesson. I mean, this is Stephen's attack against the Sanhedrin in Acts chapter 7. I mean, you said we would never persecute the prophets like the fathers did, and yet you put to death the very one the prophets were speaking about. I mean, you're worse sinners than even they are. Maybe you pride yourself on we're better than they are. You've proven yourself to be worse. No wonder they were cut to the quick and cut to the heart and threw the stones, threw them to death. So we, just with this inclusio, seeing how chapter 1 begins and how it ends, along with how chapter 65, 17, all the way through 66, 24, how it begins and ends, the beginning oracle, the ending oracle of Isaiah, how they basically have the same kind of inclusio within these two major oracles. Then I put some other connections there. Both speak about rebels against Yahweh. Both speak about new moon and Sabbath festivals. Both obviously speak about Jerusalem. It's the focus of attention, ultimately in both oracles, and how obviously in Isaiah's day, Jerusalem is despicable. It is unrighteous, and yet at the end, how there's going to be rejoicing in Jerusalem. We've already taken a look at the concept of none to quench at the end of both passages. And these are just, 5, along with new heavens and new earth, of many numbers of echoes of what is in chapter 1 that is repeated when we get to chapters 65 and 66, and at least the last chapter and a half of Isaiah, which speaks about what God is ultimately going to accomplish in the future. And put that together, what is introduced in chapter 1 is reversed by the time you get to the end of chapter 66. That the situation of the city and the people is transformed from the beginning of the book to the end of the book. And really, everything in between is how do we get from A to Z? How do we get from that beginning to end? How do we get from chapter 1 to chapter 66? And how we see from Isaiah's day to the time, the days of the new heaven and new earth, what God has and will do to accomplish His plan and His purpose. Now, having said that, therefore, Isaiah chapter 1 is a chapter which introduces the major themes, if we can put it this way, of Isaiah. Certainly introduces the major themes of the first 35 chapters of Isaiah, but we'll come back and look at it. It really deals with much more than that. All right, so we have this first major division. Goes all the way through chapter 35. Then we have this historical connection of 4 chapters, with the last 2 chapters historically introducing what we need to have to read or write chapters 40 to 66. We're now looking at the Babylonian background and Isaiah's oracles of comfort. Now I give you another chart, an adaptation from David Dorsey's book on the literary structure of the Old Testament, and I give you this. Now I've adapted it to get what I believe really are the the units of thought, the sections, as we go through the major divisions. He's made it into a grand chiasm. I'm going to reserve judgment on that, but I think what is good is the fact that what he shows is the verbal and thematic echoes as you go through the book of Isaiah. And hasn't even, given the ones that I gave from the beginning and the end. But he speaks about the themes of condemnation, of Yahweh's speaking about their hands being full of blood, of the different themes, and even in 11:6-9, the wolf will dwell with the lamb, etc., etc. And then you go to the concluding messages of the book in chapters 58-66. And it begins again in chapter 58 with the condemnation of empty religious practices, highlighting social injustice and wickedness. It talks also about the fact in chapter 59, Yahweh won't hear their prayers. Their hands are bloody. And by the time you get to 65:25, the wolf and the lamb will feed together. The lion will eat straw like the ox. They will not hurt or destroy in my holy mountain. We have a verbal echo of what is seen in Isaiah chapter 11. Then we take a look at the second section of that first division, beginning in chapter 13-27, the oracles against the nations. The oracles against proud Babylon, and particularly the humbling of the king of Babylon, humiliated, brought low, king shocked to see him. They will rise up and taunt him, and the Babylonian king has no seed. We get into chapters 49-57. We see here not a fall, but a restoration of a humbled Jerusalem anticipated. We see not the humbling of the major individual in that section, but his exaltation. Again, kings shocked to see him, mouths shut. They rise up and bow down before him, and ultimately he is going to see his seed. Just a tremendous contrast between the main character in chapters 13-27, the main character in chapter 49-57. And then in the middle, we see again, particularly at the end there, the highway in the desert, the glory of Yahweh being seen, bringing chapter 35 to a close. Chapter 40 beginning, the highway in the desert, the glory of Yahweh being seen. And in the middle we have, as he brings up the historical narratives that show Yahweh's supremacy over all earthly and divine powers. He is the one ultimately who is in control. Now, if you follow and take a look at most commentaries, most resources on Isaiah, they will use this basic threefold division that we're going to follow. And of course, I will give more support for the three divisions of the condemnation, three divisions on the comfort as we go through the book. A little bit different take on this is Oswald in the NICOT. He sees the importance of chapter 6. Now, notice again, he then will see chapters 7-39 written against the Assyrian threat. So he sees the first 5 chapters as introductory, giving what he calls the present and future of God's people, and a call to servanthood that ultimately Israel, Judah, Jerusalem is called to mirror the same attitude as Isaiah. And like Isaiah, they will learn to come to trust and follow Yahweh, going through what is recorded in chapter 7 to 39. And then he would see chapters of 40 to 55 as being addressed to the exiles in Babylon, and then chapters 56 to 66 to the post-exilic generation. And of course, he would carrying through his key understanding of servanthood. That here we have the vocation, the one who is the servant, and then those who are marked by their association with the servant, and servanthood as far as their attribute by the time you get to the end of the book. So a little different take, but you can see how basically he's dealing with the same broad sections that the traditional outline. Of course, this is reflected in the study Bible, the MacArthur Study Bible outline that you can follow as well. Now, I give you one further literary structure. This is the minority viewpoints. And it's interesting, but I give it to you once again because it highlights, the fact that there are a lot of thematic and verbal echoes as you go through the book of Isaiah. The majority tradition is to have these two major divisions separated by the historical connection. So we have three divisions, the 7 sections that we've spoken of since the beginning of class this morning. But this comes from the work by Dillard and Longman on their introduction to the Old Testament. And this, both within Jewish and Christian circles, has been an alternate approach. And there is some evidence for this even in the Qumran community, that they viewed Isaiah through this twofold approach. Now, when they say volume 1 and volume 2, they're not saying first Isaiah, second Isaiah. They're saying that, the book basically is to be understood as being in 2 parts, and that each part, to a certain extent, can stand on its own. And it's like the first major volume that goes through, as you can see, step by step, basically the same message twice. And you can see this here, that, the first 5 chapters in volume 1 begin with the ruin and restoration of Judah. And that is echoed in chapters 34 and 35. Of course, that could also be inclusio again for the beginning, introducing that which is echoed at the end. They make a very important distinction, which is, and they're very true about the fact that there is little narrative in the book of Isaiah as a whole. And yet we have a significant narrative section, particularly in chapters 6 and 7. Now, it's not one and the same narrative. It's the narrative of Isaiah's temple vision, as we saw in chapter 6. Chapter 7 is going to be the narrative of his interaction with Ahaz, and they would carry that all the way through chapter 8, and they're thinking that continues to be a record of what Isaiah said to Ahaz. And of course, it's interesting that Isaiah is sent by the conduit of the upper pool to interact with Ahaz, to meet Ahaz there, to interact with him and give him his message. And they bring up, then you have the narrative in chapters 36 to 39. Interestingly, again, in chapter 36, where Isaiah is sent to the conduit of the upper pool. And so they say, All right, so that these narratives, at least the last narrative of 7 and 8 and the first narrative of 36 and 37 are tied in to a geographical landmark. And then there's an introductory narrative, there's a concluding narrative that make up the section. Then they speak in chapters 9 through 12 of the agents of blessing and judgments. The agent being an ideal king, introduced in chapter 9, and then further spoken of in chapter 11. In chapter 11, we have the introduction of the concept of the second Exodus. And again, in chapters 40 to 45, we have an introduction of the ideal servant, who's going to be the agent of deliverance. And once again, we have the introduction of the theme of the second Exodus that is there in chapters 41, again through chapter 45. Now we have this lengthy section of oracles against foreign nations in 13 to 23. They would see that echoed in chapters 46 to 48, which is not oracles against nations plural, but against Babylon, the nation which begins the oracles in chapters 13 and 14 is the nation again brought up in chapters 46 to 48. With the judgment and deliverance of God's people, 24 to 27, with the redemption through the Lord's servant, with the glorification of Israel in chapters 49 through 55, leading to ethical sermons, 28 to 31, 56 to 59. Once again, we've already brought out with some of the same sins being spoken about. With the ultimate restoration of Judah and the Davidic kingdom, and it's true that does hold true in chapters 32 to 33, and how this is spelled out in more detail in chapters 55 to 66. And again, this comes from an ancient tradition within Judaism that speaks in terms of the fact that Isaiah is to be understood as a biunity. In other words, it is a unity in two parts. And so what they have sought to do is to give, what they think is evidence of it. Now, this might be true, gentlemen. I still see the movement of the book as being better understood, with the more traditional approach. Maybe I am just been so ingrained in it, so indoctrinated in it, since it's been the way I have studied Isaiah from the very beginning. It's the only early outline I knew, and so I've read Isaiah against my understanding of this approach, which we're going to take in class. But I have to admit, it's very, very interesting, and there is an element within the historical interpretation of Isaiah. There's always been this minority viewpoint, as I said, going back, to our earliest Jewish traditions that speak about Isaiah as a unity, as a biunity, and the division is between chapters 33 and 34. By the way, that's also followed in a literary format in the Word Biblical Commentary that seeks to look at it less historically and more thematically, and uses that by union approach as well. So, but what I show is the fact that no matter how you approach Isaiah, you see a lot of similar theme and terminology, which argues not for multiple authors, but what? the more you see, the same basic themes, the same basic terminology being used. It argues for one author, not two. And that's where we're going to approach it in this class. As I usually say at this point, I'm the teacher, I get to choose. All right, and my evaluation is I still think there is a greater merit to the three division or two major division with a connecting division approach. And I've had to defend that in numbers of venues, and I'm saying, okay, Isaiah is this kind of a book which is so interrelated that there is a possibility to see themes being picked up and developed. But whether that should lead to a whole change of literary structure, I guess I have not yet been convinced through my reading of the literature and my reading of the book of Isaiah. And when I give you what I think are the best resources on the book, that except for Oswald, and I have given you his basic structural approach, that the other three major works on the book take the basic approach that I'm taking as far as the structure of the book is concerned. Two major divisions with a central division, historical division, and basically, even though we would disagree exactly where some of the chapters might begin and end, but basically a movement of three parts in the first division and three parts in the latter division. And that gets us, obviously, to the works, and Isaiah has been well served in contemporary evangelicalism. These are three excellent, actually adding Oswald, four excellent commentaries, and of course, as you can see, three of them are multi-volumed. Now, E.J. Young, who was for many years the professor of Old Testament at Westminster Theological Seminary in Philadelphia, who really, from the beginning of that seminary till the early 60s, was really Mr. Old Testament. He was the Dr. Barrick of the early days of Westminster Theological Seminary. And he was the first editor of the NICOT, and chose himself to write on Isaiah. So the very first volumes in the NICOT were Young's work on Isaiah, and then he passed away, and another editor took his place, who contacted Dr. Oswald to go ahead and do the replacement, bring them up to date. Every generation supposedly has to have a new commentary in the NIC. We got to keep it new. I mean, let's face it, if the commentary is 50 years old, it's really the old international commentary on the Old Testament. So they got to keep it new. If that's the justification. All right. But Young's volumes were so influential that to this day they are still in print. You can still buy the paperback versions, 3 volumes. They're continually being sold. And so Young, being dead, still lives as far as his words. And certainly those 3 volumes, outstanding Hebrew scholar, outstanding exegetical commentary, and then now the work by Oswald in the new NIC. So he's the one who's got the title NIC OT. Now one day he will die. If the Lord tarries, and someone will have a 3rd edition of an NIC on Isaiah. Young is very, very good philologically. That is his understanding of the Hebrew language, syntax. He is very, very good historically. And of course, historical, grammatical, that was the emphasis of his day. Oswald is stronger, also obviously being a good Hebrew scholar, but is much better in dealing with the literary structure and of not only the book as a whole, but also the parts, and a little bit more of a biblical theological emphasis in Oswald that was not as prevalent in E.J. Young. Young is good in going through a passage. Oswald is better in tying the passage together into the totality of the book, its context. So, someone says, well, which one is better? Yes. All right. In other words, both have value. And you're going to find material in Oswald that is not in Young, and vice versa. Now, for most of us, we don't want to begin at that level. We like to be. Is there a one-volume commentary that's kind of blends the best of all of that? And the answer is yes, there is. It's the work by the British Old Testament scholar J. Alec Motyer, The Prophecy of Isaiah. He figured it all out in about 500 to 600 pages. And the great value of Motyer, and get this one, not his more abbreviated Tyndale. Now, his Tyndale is good and obviously much cheaper. So Motyer actually wrote the Tyndale, and he wrote too much. So he got that in print, and then he went back, and actually he said he started all over again and tried to do Isaiah in about 300 words, smaller pages, and probably word count maybe just about half of what's in his larger commentary. But really, Isaiah, you need... All right, you can start with the Tyndale, but you'll be far enough along, both in your reading Isaiah and your knowledge of the Hebrew, that you can certainly go through his one-volume work. It's called The Prophecy of Isaiah. To this day, I still find this the best place to start with Isaiah, once you've worked through, like one of the study Bibles, just getting an understanding of Isaiah chapter by chapter, and the flow of the book. And so I highly recommend the first book you use is Motyer. And then Gary Smith's NAC is a very, very good work too. And many of you will get that set on your computer program, so be sure to look at Smith. He's a good scholar on the prophets and has done a good, commendable work on Isaiah. And then as far as preaching, the work by Ray Ortlund Jr., Isaiah, God Saves Sinners. Now remember what I said, the great theme of Isaiah is it's God, Yahweh, and the relationship of trust that God's people are called to have in their God. I say that because Ortlund, when he gets, is going to take a little different slant, obviously, on the future passages than I do. But when he speaks about God and God's revelation of himself in Isaiah and what our response should be to God, gentlemen, he's got some great messages. And go and do likewise. That doesn't make any difference what your eschatological position is on that. That's great exegesis. And he says, right within the book, that basically he's basing his messages on the works of Oswald and Motyer. These are the standard commentaries. He's not reinventing the wheel. By the way, gentlemen, that proves you too can be a good commentator and you don't have to reinvent the wheel. Use the wheel that God has given to you. And Ortlund does that. And as I said, some of his messages, particularly where he centers on Yahweh, and as I said, Yahweh's revelation and our response as God's people to Yahweh, what it should be, based upon Isaiah. You'll find his sermons not only true to the text, but I think also sermons that will challenge your own heart. So not only give you understanding, but also give you spiritual challenge as well. And probably is, to my knowledge, at this point, about the best set of series of sermons on Isaiah that I know that is presently in print. Actually, he preached through this at his Presbyterian church, and I believe Tennessee is where he's ministering at the time, and so he preached them and then got them into print, and very, very well worth having as you go from text to sermon. All right, any questions on structure? Any questions on resources?
One of the things that it seems like is key to understanding the structure is understanding the function of chapters 34 and 35.
Mm-hmm.
Because some will say that that begins a new section,
Right.
Some will say that that's the ending of another section. Could you comment briefly on just how those fit into the overall structure?
Well, when we get there, I think, again, we'll see in chapters 28 to 35 that already, I mean, you're already speaking in terms of a restoration that's going to take place in chapter 32, and then Isaiah is going to return to that basic concept in chapter 35. But why again do you have, and certainly chapter 34, 35 echo what has gone before more than prepare the way for what comes after. And that's one of the big reasons that I would say that Isaiah throughout the course of those first 35 chapters, doesn't let any of his sections or even mini sections, end up on the note of just his judgment with no conclusion. And can then come back and speak further about judgments. All right, so that I wouldn't see in the same way chapter 34 being, that it's an end in chapter 32, so that the chapters 34, 35, 33 to 35 become anticlimactic, particularly 34 and 35. I would say no, this fits into the basic strategy that we see in the first 35 chapters. I am more the sense of taking a look at the fact of how it has been accepted that the background from which chapters 1 to 35 come is Isaiah's own day and the Assyrian issue. That everything can be explained in those first 35 chapters as Isaiah speaking to his own generation, his own day, and Assyria basically being the issue. And then you can go back in the Kings and this whole: are we vassals? Are we going to submit to Assyria? Or are we going to resist Assyria? All right, and if we resist, who do we turn to? You turn to Egypt, and so that gives you the whole understanding that basically is necessary for those first 35 chapters. Now, everybody agrees by the time you start reading chapter 40, it's the same Isaiah, it's the same words, same themes, but now it is packaged much differently. As I said, Israel, all right, you are, you've sinned and you're paying the price for your sin. And even when God makes a way of escape, a way of salvation, Israel is not quick to respond. So again, even chapter 58 is going to begin with Isaiah spelling out Israel's sin, all over again. But that's not the major emphasis of those last 27 chapters. That's only a prelude, because much more is spoken about Yahweh the Redeemer, Yahweh's salvation, the redemption that He's going to bring in the future. And frankly, I think a better a better argument can be made that chapters 38 and 39 give you the background for chapters 40 to 66. That's a better understanding than to say that the introductions in chapters 34 and 35. So, and like I said, it's the way I've always approached the book, and I just have not. I have not seen the traditional approach, fail to help me get the big picture and also, fit the micro pieces into that macro structure. But as I said, even Oswald has a little bit of a variation of the traditional approach. So, and here's one of the issues, Jim, when we come to literary structure. We're not trying to find Isaiah's outline because he didn't have one. Isaiah did not write an Occidental outline out and say, okay, here's my outline, discover it. Certainly, the way in which, Old Testament books are structured is by means of these other literary devices, particularly of repetition, of saying the same things different ways. And of course, the problem we have with Isaiah vis-a-vis Jeremiah and Ezekiel is that Isaiah doesn't date anything. He doesn't really introduce anything. He just starts talking about whatever he's going to talk about. Well, actually, it's writing about what he did talk about. But he doesn't link in a narrative way like we have with Jeremiah and Ezekiel. Now, Jeremiah is going to do the same thing in the first basically 24 chapters of his book. He's going to be very Isaiah, and then all of a sudden he's going to start giving you a lot of narrative and a lot of even datings of where things take place. And then Ezekiel is going to be the glory of all preachers everywhere, because he is going to go through and date exactly when the word of the Lord came to him, that's recorded in each section of his book. And so Ezekiel is the outliner's prophet. Because there's no debate upon where the sections begin and end. But I think it's all part and parcel of God driving us into the text and seeking to the fewer hints that are there at the surface, the more you got to dig into the text to see what is there and start to be able to pull it together. Now, I should take that back. I was going to say I never really asked Dr. Grisani what his approach is, but I do know the structure of the book given by Rooker, and again a little bit of tweaking. But you can see that the outline now, instead of saying there's three major divisions, you'll notice that for Rooker he has the four major divisions in his mind, the first four sections that end in chapter 35. Then he's got his historical transition, and then everyone pretty much agrees that the last 27 chapters are a unit. And again, he divides that unit into three sections. Now, by looking at my outline and even Rooker, you can, and mine is closer to Dr. MacArthur's. The question is, what's the relation with chapters 24 to 27, to 13 to 23? And my answer is they conclude it. Rooker would say no, it's a different style. It's talking about visions of the end as opposed to visions of what is now with the nations. And so he would say that there's enough distinction between the two sets of oracles that he would put them into separate parts. And the great debate on what to do with chapters 56 and 57. Do they complete the second oracle of comfort, consolation, or begin the third? And I would say with that restatement of Israel's sin in chapter 58, that's where the third movement begins. But you can see that Rooker's basic outline is the same as the outline that we're going to follow within the text, as far as the class is concerned. I didn't bring my MacArthur Study Bible. You'll see that Dr. MacArthur's outline is fairly close to what we're following here in class. So I guess that's my ultimate, hey, if Dr. MacArthur ends up there, it can't be wrong. But now let me just say a word. Oh, it is time for break, but just a word about that first interpretive problem. I've already spoken to it. The text speaks to it. And certainly this is a good place to conclude our discussion of literary structure, and particularly and the charts I've given to you that you have that show the similarity of themes and terminology as you go through Isaiah. And these are the means, along with the historical acceptance of the book for all the way to 1800, that Isaiah is viewed as one book, what I call here the Orthodox viewpoint. There is one author. Now, I believe on the basis of the New Testament that author is Isaiah. So that particularly, and I'm not sure, did we look at John 12 already in this course? Take a look back at John chapter 12, or ahead in your Bibles. Take a look at John chapter 12. Jesus Christ affirms two passages that are the word of Isaiah. 12:38. Jesus spoke. This is John. But though he had performed so many signs before them, they were not believing him. So that, verse 38 says John, the word of Isaiah the prophet might be fulfilled, which he spoke. Lord, who has believed our report, and to whom has the arm of the Lord been revealed? Isaiah 53, verse 1. Categorized by John the Apostle as what? The word of Isaiah the prophet, which he spoke. For this cause they could not believe, for Isaiah said again, he has blinded their eyes and hardened their heart, lest they see with their eyes, perceive with their heart, and be converted, and I heal them. Isaiah chapter 6, verse 10, which once again is what Isaiah said. These things Isaiah said because he saw his glory, and he spoke of him. Of course, that gives the context of Isaiah chapter 6. Isaiah saw, Isaiah said, Isaiah spoke. Now, obviously, we have a written document. I have no problem if someone takes, and Smith leans toward this position, That ultimately Isaiah is the one who spoke, but what we are reading is an editor writing for us Isaiah's words. All right, I can live with that. That's within the boundaries of John chapter 12. But when someone says that the same Isaiah who spoke and whose words are recorded in chapter 1 is not the same Isaiah who spoke and whose words are recorded in chapter 53, has a problem with the New Testament. Because this was a perfect time for John the Apostle to say, the word of the second Isaiah came to pass. Now I know, liberal accommodation, that John was just a man of his day, apostle or not, scripture or not. Everybody of his day assumed that everything went back to Isaiah. But we know better. And my answer is no, we don't. If you say you know better than John the Apostle, you got a pride problem. All right, so the Orthodox viewpoint, you got to take either one or two. Now, I believe at the end of his life, God led Isaiah to write. By the way, you can, the Dictionary of the Old Testament Prophets, you can go to numbers of articles and they question this. They will say, okay, we can hear echoes of the prophets, but we got to realize the books were written later. We don't know what the process was. To some extent, they're right on that. But now we do our redactional studies, and now we're able to kind of figure out what came from da-da-da-da. And because of that, I haven't given you a number of the articles in there. Even the ones you read, you'll probably say, why did you put those in the notes? I would say after reading some of the articles and reading the Dictionary of the Old Testament Prophets, that probably we have a bigger issue today as evangelicals when it comes to the Old Testament prophets and the other part of the Old Testament. Even most evangelicals today are willing to assume there is a basic nucleus, a pretty enlarged nucleus of Mosaic material that is in the Torah. Again, going back to 501, maybe it's the Hittite-Susanite treaties which have helped to give evangelicals some backbone to believe that. I would say this, that the Black Dictionary on the Pentateuch is much more conservative than this Black Dictionary on the prophets. Both put out by InterVarsity Press, both having evangelical editors, well-known evangelical editors. Taking a look at all 4 volumes, I would say today that we as evangelicals, you're going to have a greater struggle with the Old Testament prophets than any other part of the Old Testament. And I'm not sure in OTI they're able to do that much with a special introduction of the prophets. So I'm giving you at least a foundation here. And that is, this Orthodox viewpoint begins with the Bible's affirmation itself. John 12 makes it very, very clear. When you're reading Isaiah, you're reading the words that God gave to Isaiah. And there's not a multiple of Isaiahs. It's one Isaiah. That then is substantiated, obviously, by further tradition. That's the way it's been accepted by Jews and Christians through 1800 AD. And the only thing we dispute is, did Isaiah in his own day write his words, or was there an editor later who took what Isaiah had said and put them in the form that we have it today? And that's not so much with Isaiah, but we will get to Jeremiah, and Jeremiah dictates his words to Baruch. Did Isaiah have a secretary? I don't know. Who's only responsible for the book? The secretary, quote unquote editor, or the prophet? And I'm still going to go back to our very first day, that it goes back to the example of Moses. And so I assume that just as Moses was the author of the Torah, clearly affirmed, no one doubts that within the biblical tradition, affirmed them by the Jewish and Christian tradition, the Orthodox viewpoint. I can't say the same thing about the latter prophets who write like latter Moseses to the people. So, of course, my position is B1. I think not only do we hear Isaiah, but we hear Isaiah because Isaiah is the one responsible for the text as we have it. He's the one who put it in the order that we have it in. He is author, he is editor, in the same way as Moses for the Torah. Can I live with someone who says there's Isaiah the prophet, we read his words, but it comes through the hand of an editor, a secretary, like Jeremiah with Baruch? Hey, I can live with that. I don't see that as being unorthodox. But when you start telling me I'm hearing 2 or 3 different prophets in the book, and the latter 2 writing in the spirit of the original, that is beyond what Scripture will allow. And frankly, I don't even think position A, the critical viewpoints, are wrong. I think they border on blasphemy. But that's just me. And you don't have to go quite that far, but you can study, but you better end up, and again, as I said, at least for these books, the commentaries that I have recommended are going to be more conservative than some of the articles in this dictionary. So, if you read something amiss in here, go to the commentaries and they'll help you to get the right viewpoint.